In this video and the video that will probably follow it, we're going to be looking at how we can incorporate Navigation Experimental, which is an exciting part of the React Native ecosystem for moving from one page to another. So what I've done here is I have decided to, of course, start with something a little more interesting than just me talking and talking and talking and topping, and that is a demo. So I'm just going to jump to my command line here, and this is my reference application, which I usually build before I try and explain what I'm doing to people on the internet. And we're just going to open the project, and we're going to run it. So here we go. I can fetch recipes. Presumably this is going to be doing a search. We can see that there's all these wonderful recipes. And then when I tap on something, I get to a detail page. I haven't spent a lot of time doing the styling work because I'm assuming that's something that we can talk about in another video. But you can see that there's a detail page, and then I can go back, and then the bottom tabs are still functioning as expected. So we are going to start with the project files that were included in the last video, and you can of course download those on GitHub. Let's talk a little bit about the architecture for a minute. So in the current version of the application that you'll be checking out, basically we had an index.ios.js file, and inside that we had the app container, and that's where we hooked Redux up. Then we had this application tabs component, which we developed in the last video. And inside that, we had two different views. We had the About tab, and then we had the Home tab. Now, in the new version that we're going to be building together, the app container is going to stay the same. The index.ios.js file is going to stay the same. And in fact, the application tabs are also going to stay the same with their About and Home. The two things that are going to change, though, are this detail page, which is going to sit inside of a scene container. Now, the scene container is going to use React Native's Navigation Experimental for handling animations between different views in our application. So let's get started. So when I first built this application, we were using React Native, I believe 0.28, and this is a part of the application or a part of the React Native library that is changing very rapidly. And so even between when I started this video series and now, the reference implementation for Navigation Experimental has changed. So we're also going to cover upgrading our version of React Native to the latest version, which, based on this video, is 0.31. So I'm just going to fetch recipes, make sure this is still working. Of course, when I tap, nothing happens, but everything else is in place. So the first thing I'm going to do is shut this down, and I'm going to type npm install --save React-native at 0.31. Okay, great. So it looks like React Native was successfully updated. I'm just going to check to see that everything is functioning correctly by typing, just go to the package project, oops. And I'm going to type npm start. Now, if I refresh this page, if I refresh my simulator, everything should be functioning as expected. It's just recompiling the application. And it looks like we're up and running. And then I'm just going to check the package.json file to see that, in fact, React Native has been upgraded to 0.31. So everything seems to be working all right. Now, I've already covered what a reducer is, what an action is, and how those things orchestrate different state changes in the view. And we're actually going to start with the reducer and the actions in our refactor of our application to support Navigation Experimental. But before we can do that, of course, I'm going to define certain types that will have to exist in this new version of our application. So let's go to the types that currently exist. Now you can already see that I've broken out a section for navigation here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define two more types of actions in our application. The first one's going to be navigation forward, which is going to be navigation forward, and navigation back, which is going to be navigation back. So with these two in place, I now have two different actions that I can now work with in my application. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the reducer, And we'll just go to the navigation reducer here. Now you can see that we're already creating a reducer for the tabs, and we've defined different tabs in our application that are currently supported. So to start off, I'm going to create a new kind of reducer called navigation state. We're going to still follow the same create reducer pattern. And I'm going to specify that the default index is going to be 0. And then I'm going to define a few different routes that are going to be supported. This is very similar to what we did with the tabs. And by having that kind of orthogonality in the application, hopefully things are a little clearer down the line. So the tabs that I'm going to support, or the routes that I'm going to support, will have two keys. One of them is going to be application tabs. And the other one is going to be detail. Now, these are going to be the components that, or the containers that are going to be loaded for the different routes of the application. Now, the next step is going to be defining some of the responses that this reducer will have to various actions in our application. Now, since we've already defined navigation forward, we can use that here. And then we'll do the same thing with navigation back. And now we're actually going to take advantage of some of the framework that already exists in React Native Navigation Experimental. So you can see that I've already imported the navigation state utils up there. And so for navigation forward, I'm just going to return navigation state utils dot forward, and I'm just going to pass the state in. And so there's already a transformation that takes place that is part of the shape or the specification for handling React Native Experimental that the navigation state utils provides. And so by doing this, we can then easily plug in the animation framework and work with the rest of React Native's Navigation Experimental library without having to implement our own version of navigation and routing. Just going to indent that a little bit. And then we're going to do the same thing with back. And there you have it. Now, the other thing I want to do, and we're going to touch on this a little later, but I think it's going to be helpful to have certain parameters that we can pass to our routes. And something I've personally found with Redux is that it's a lot easier to work with different smaller reducers than to have one mega reducer. So I'm also going to create a new reducer called navigation params. And the default for that's going to be nothing. However, it's going to listen for the forward action, and it's going to update itself with whatever the action.state key is. And so this way, if we want to pass certain bits of data to other routes, and in our case it's going to be the ID for a particular recipe, we can just pass that along in the action, and then it'll be stored in the navigation params reducer for that route, for that currently selected route in our application. So far, so good. Let's just refresh and make sure that we haven't broken anything. Looks like everything's okay. And now let's move on to the actions. So we have the reducers, but of course the reducers aren't going to do anything unless there's an action to perform. So let's take a look at the actions navigation.js file. And over here, we're going to be adding a little bit of functionality as well. Because in order to translate or move from one state to another, we need to, of course, navigate. So I'm going to export a new function called navigate. And it's going to take an action as a variable. And it's going to return dispatch and get state. This is a common pattern. And here we're just going to dispatch with navigate forward. Now, Navigation Experimental supports different kinds of navigations. There's forward, backwards, there's pop and push. So you can treat your navigation either as a stack of cards where you're adding things, like a modal window, or you can move forwards and backwards, which I think is more appropriate in our case. And of course, the animations associated with these activities will be different. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to implement navigate forward. And in this case, it's going to be just a very simple data structure with a type. In this case, it's going to be navigate forward. and then we're just going to pass the state down. And we don't need to expose that to the rest of the application, so I'm not going to export it. And then the last thing we're going to implement in our actions is navigate back. With the assumption that when we go back, we don't necessarily have to tell the application what we're going back to, because the navigation state utils and the data structure that that supports is going to have all that information for us. And so here, we're just going to return. We'll just grab the dispatch and the get state. And then I will dispatch, except that this time the type is going to be types.navigationBack. And that's it. All right, let's refresh again. And so far, so good. Everything's still behaving. Oh, let me just refresh again. I think that was a network error. Oh, it probably has to do with the application needing to be rebuilt. Now that we've upgraded React Native, a lot of these initial libraries need to be rebuilt, since of course React Native ships with more than just JavaScript. And now if we fetch recipes, searching, and boom, we still get everything that we would expect. And it looks like the navigation state is now visible, and I can see that, and I have 2 routes. And I also have the navigation params, and that's an empty data structure. Great. So in the next video, we're actually going to start refactoring our views and bringing in Navigation Experimental on the view layer. Thanks for listening.